for the past 16 years, I've been working as a product manager on many different Google's products, by and large in the advertising space, on the search, display, and video advertising space for most part of my time. Also building Google's own CRM system along the way. And the last part of my work at Google has been with Google's cloud computing business unit, where my team is responsible for building infrastructure resource management products, which is intended for products like YouTube, Google advertising, Google search, to request for the compute, storage, and network resources in any worldwide locations at a given point of time in a given quantity of the demand, and they would get allocated those resources as they need on demand. That is the high level cut of what my product does. And it is basically an inherent infrastructure product that every product has to use, including Google Cloud. So I'm proud of making my product usable for every Google product. So in other words, in some sense, it is a product platform on which all Google's products run. That is probably easy way to summarize. So that without further ado, let me start by sharing some of the stories today. As I was telling you earlier, the style that I would like to stick to is more of a recommended or suggested kind of stories, or rather best practices. So I split the presentation into two parts. The first one is about things that you want to do before your presentation and a couple of best practices to that extent. And second is during the presentation, there are three sets of suggestions that I would like to make. And then there are stories that go with each of these suggestions. So in order to tell the story in a nice way, I picked a format. I would call that format as star L format. So let me explain what that format is so that it's easy for you to follow what I'm trying to explain. Star L format stands for S for situation. I'm going to first explain what the situation is. And the T and A stand for task or action. What action did I or my coworker has taken at that time? And R stands for result. What happened? This is not about what we expected to happen. This is about what really happened as result. And L stands for a learning. Now looking back, what can we learn from the situation? So every story that I'm going to tell you will use that same consistent format. So with that, let me get to the first story of the day, which is socializing the presentation with key people. So when you are presenting to executives, more or less all the time, you will also have stakeholders of your product that come into play. So the story here goes like this. In the situation, I was a product owner for a revenue data warehouse product, of which sales reports get generated. And when I inherited the product, it had lots of issues with it, namely the unresponsiveness of the system, data reliability or trustworthiness was one of the main issues, and freshness of the data was the second issue. So these are just like the tip of the iceberg kind of problems. But then when I inherited the product, my main goal was to come up with a revamped or a restructured product that would solve these problems. It's very easy to explain, right? The problem, and then the solution is to build a product that is highly responsive and is reliable, trustworthy from the data perspective, and offers fresh data for my stakeholders. So here my stakeholders were sales and sales operations from the sales side. Finance was the other stakeholder because they are the partners that define the business logic. How do we define the metrics? How do we define the way to slice and dice the metrics? That is the logic that comes from finance. So that sets the stage for what the situation was. Now, the task that I had was to basically present this proposal where I'm asking for executive approval to build this product so that we can solve these problems. Very straightforward. But one thing that I missed out was to make sure that my sales operations and finance partners have seen this deck so that they have a clear understanding of how I articulated the problems, how I also showed the priorities of the problems, and then what is the solution that I proposed and how we plan on building it. Although there were many conversations that I have had with them about what the product would look like, what is it that we're going to work first, what we're going to work next, etc., etc. So all those conversations have happened, but formally, I've not shared the deck with my stakeholders. That, obviously was a mistake. Now let's get to the result. So what happened during the presentation? So as soon as I started showing the deck, I first talked about the fact that the data was stale for most of the time, and many of the users have complained for weeks about the data staleness, which is defined from their perspective as, when I'm looking at the data today, I have some expectations as a user that the data should be updated as of today or as of end of yesterday. Whatever may be the case is the expectation on part of the user, but that expectation was failed by the product. So as I started talking about it, one of the finance people obviously was upset that I haven't shared the deck with them, started saying that that is not the highest priority. And another sales operations person piled on and said, yeah, that is true. That is not the highest priority problem. We need to worry about correcting the trustworthiness of the data as the higher order priority. And then everyone started piling on, and very soon I've experienced firsthand what people call as a pile-on effect. A pile-on effect is when you make a mistake or someone says something and everyone basically piles on that argument, and then you're buried deep under and you cannot recover, right? So I realized that there is no way that I could recover. So very first thing that I had to do was to say, I apologize. This is just a set of priorities that I'm presenting in no particular order, but this is not the sequence in which the solution will be built. So please bear with me for some more time. And I had to do that many, many times. But in the end, the presentation was okay in the sense that I was able to present the deck, but then it left a bad taste in my mouth because it still was not the best outcome that I expected. Because on one hand, I was feeling that I worked so hard to make my customers, my stakeholders happy because I'm solving their problems. Now, how come they are not supportive of me? How come they are not supporting me was the feeling that bothered me quite a bit. So looking back, the learning from this experience was that getting feedback from your stakeholders is paramount. It's for many reasons. Today's example, I only covered one of the reasons, right? But there can be many instances, like in the breakout session that we were talking with Dan and few others, that there can be other reasons that are important why you need to make sure that people have a stake in the product or in the deck that you're presenting. Even if you predominantly put all the effort in bringing up the slides, it is still obligatory on your part as a product manager to make sure that your stakeholders give you the feedback and you get the feeling that you heard them, and you come prepared to a presentation with executives with all that having done as a pre-work. So that I would like to pause as the first story, end of first story, and the learning from this story. And if there are any any questions, I would like to address them before we go to the second story.
Hey, Ravi.
Yeah.
This is Josh. So, do you share entire deck, or do you just kind of share the part? Because sometimes you're working on the deck almost like until the before the meeting, right? So, is there any like a practical tip on the sharing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say most of the times what I've done was never wait until the finished version of the deck is ready and share the deck sooner. The sooner the better. Here is the reason. The sooner you share the deck, you would save yourself a whole lot of work or rework that you may have to do, because you will go in one direction or one set of direction that prompts you to put in a lot of effort to put the slides together. But then if you wait too long until the end, you may have to rework on a whole lot of slides. You can save a lot of time, and the best practice that I've used myself is go something like this. The very first slide, I create the story of what we want to cover in the presentation. And each bullet point in that story will be a slide that will come in the detailed version of the slide deck. And then I start working on each of those bullet points as a slide, in itself. That is where I get feedback. So I want to pause here before I go further if I address your question, Josh.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It almost kind of like reminds me of like product development, like a lean product development type of thing. So get the feedback early and often. So thank you.
That's right.
Hey, Ravi, do you have any advice for what to do if you ask for feedback before a meeting and you don't get any?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It happens all the time. Basically, what I try to do is that before the presentation, I more or less invariably schedule one-on-one with executives and stakeholders, because one-on-one gets you direct attention, right? That doesn't give the excuse for the participants to use their laptop while you're talking or you're trying to get their attention. Instead, in one-on-one, you get their undivided attention. That is reason one. Reason number two, a lot of times people will be more forthcoming in a one-on-one setting to give exactly what they have in their mind without worrying about the presence of other people. So that is what I would advise as the best practice, at least to the extent that I've seen, in terms of getting the feedback.
Thank you.
So let me go to the second story, and we can always come back and revisit any of the topics towards the end. So I hope the transition to the second slide, I hope is kind of like instantaneous, so we're able to see my second slide. And for obvious reasons, I'm not reading out exact content on the slide, because this is mainly for setting the stage so that I can tell you the story in a nice way. So let's go back to our star L format again, where let me describe the situation first. This is the experience that I've seen, very interesting experience. One of my coworkers has presented. And in this particular case, without divulging a lot of private information of my coworker, let me try to speak in more neutral language. So the product that he was building was supposed to work like a budget recommender. And as you know, in advertising, there are a lot of customers who spend a lot of money with Google. And this particular product is supposed to take large advertisers and their data as input. It would recommend how to split the budget dollars into display advertising versus search advertising. As simple as that. So that is why this product was called Budget Recommender. And my coworker was coming in to present to the executives to ask their approval to launch the beta version of the product to certain large advertisers. That was the setting. And the product, it works in a very simple way. It has some predefined data about all of the advertisers, because we have that information already in our systems. And it also takes the goals and the objectives of different advertisers as the input as well. And finally, it provides certain other inputs about suggesting a new budget with certain new goals, and then let the system come back with a recommendation about how the customer or the advertiser should split their budget. That is the background. And the stakeholders here are the salespeople and the executives. And as we walked in, my coworker did not make the mistake that I made. And he was smart enough to share the deck with the stakeholders. So everyone has seen, everyone has given their input, so on and so forth. But something interesting happened. As soon as he started talking about the product and how it works, one of the executives asked for the link to the product so that he could play around with the product. So my coworker had graciously, shared the link to Budget Recommender up front in the slide deck itself. So he said, feel free to, try it out. You should be able to play with the product without worrying about, access issues. And as soon as he started talking, about his second slide into the product features, one of the executives raised his hand and said, I have an issue that I found out. And everyone's attention obviously was there. And the executive said, look, I took a search advertising customer who exclusively and almost always spends on only search advertising and has distaste for spending their budget dollars on display, as an example, and I inputted their name to get a budget recommendation. And interestingly, your product is recommending that the budget be split 50-50 between display advertising and search advertising. Everyone was stunned at that moment, and there was pin drop silence in the room because the product is telling something that is contradictory to the reality or the ground truth. And everyone knew that it does not make sense. So my coworker was in such a fix that he had to immediately call for a break and saying that, sorry for wasting your time. I'm going to have to fix the product and come back at a later time because it does not work the way the ground reality tells us how the budget should be recommended. So my apologies. And then he basically had to cut short his presentation and walk away. This was like, very unique and not so common kind of experiences. But then, we went back and thought as a team with the rest of the PMs, what we could have done different, what could have done to avoid this situation. And one thing that came out very clearly was that, he should have asked some of us to play around with the product, the fellow product managers, or he could have even asked the team members, like those people in UX, in engineering, or in sales to play around with the product and make sure that some commonly known customers data will come out correctly and the product will predict in a way that is consistent with the ground truth and reality. That way we would be foolproofing the product before you go to the executives who then can test the product, and you are already going to pass the obvious tests that they will do. And even if there are some more errors, you won't come out as as building a product that makes obvious mistakes at a minimum. So as a takeaway, have an extra pair of eyes. And the reason why extra pair of eyes is underscored here is because it is not you. You are so close to the product as a product manager that sometimes we get blinded by what we build, and we don't try to test some scenarios that other people can envision. So that is the reason, have an extra pair of eyes, review and catch any errors in the product or in the deck that you're about to present. So that's the end of the second story. If there are questions, I'll pause here before we go to the third one.
And Ravi, I have a question. So what you're recommending is not like a QA testing, but more to strategically validate that your problem, the solution, and the ultimate output is all aligned, and somebody's kind of doing a sanity check end to end, right? Like maybe another product partner or another stakeholder who kind of does that review for you, right?
That is correct. In a lot of enterprise companies, they routinely do this test. They call this as white glove testing. Mm-hmm. And white glove testing is typically done by other product managers, other subject matter experts who can catch some obvious errors that might seem okay for QA people, right? QA may not really be able to catch this, but people who have the knowledge about, the customer or the domain can catch such errors. So you're right, Neha. That is what the intent is here.
And this is really interesting because it's different than we do staff releases where we release the feature internally just for staff, but that would still not solve the problem what you're recommending, right? Like it would not bring in the user centricity to this white glove testing. So you do need somebody who has a sense of the market and the users in order to test the product. It's really good. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So sorry, because I'm going a little bit slow and hopefully we're not going to run out of time. So let me jump to the story number 3, and I'll try to go a little bit faster this time so we can have more time for Q&A. I hope the slide has switched to the third story. So this is like, a common example that all product managers can relate to. Let me describe the situation. More or less every time we present any deck to executives, one of the key things that we present is why we are building the product. What are the success metrics? How the product is going to increase the revenue for the company or the business, how it is going to decrease the costs, how is it going to improve the productivity of certain type of users that we are trying to build the product for. So those are the metrics and the success metrics that we call. And invariably in most of the executive presentations, there will be a slide where you talk about the numbers or the metrics, right? It's a very common case. Now, the situation here is that I was a product manager presenting my product, how it improves sales productivity by 2 hours every week. And routinely, I kind of showed a slide where by saving 2 hours in a week for a sales force of 10,000 people would result in 500 headcount savings. And that is the math that I kind of glossed over. And when I went to that slide, I started talking about, the 2-hour savings in productivity for every salesperson, and how it results in 10,000 people sales organization as 20,000 hours saved every week. But then the audience in the room, not just the executives, were used to understanding the language of tell me how many headcount savings does that mean. And to address that question, I already calculated the number and showed that as 500 people. But then all of a sudden, one of the VPs raised a hand and said, can you explain how did the math work out? Like 20,000 hours savings for salespeople in a week, how does it translate to 500 people headcount? I was stunned for a moment. Of course, I knew how the math was because I did the calculations myself and I put the slide together myself. But then because I did not really practice how to explain that in a nice way, for a moment, I was blanked out completely during the presentation. And what bothered me more was the silence, where the collective knowledge of so many senior executives in the room was working against me, that I didn't somehow know something so simple and I can't explain, and I looked like an idiot in front of all the executives. But then it took me a few minutes and someone else's help in the room when a smart finance person came out and said, well, we have a 40-hour week for a salesperson. Now you divide that 20,000 saved hours by 40, you'll get 500 people as a headcount savings. And fortunately, that person has saved me during that presentation. But of course, it didn't stop me from feeling bad because it's such a simple thing that I knew all along, but I was not prepared to explain it. Not so much from the way that I understand it, but the way that other people understand it. So the result was that, yeah, I know it was still an okay presentation, but it didn't stop me from walking out with, pretty bad taste in my mouth that I couldn't explain a very simple calculation for an executive. And they must have thought that I'm an idiot. So the takeaway here is that no matter how simple a calculation or a number that you're showing in your slides, make sure that you can explain the math in a very simple way to other people, not to yourself. So the issue is always about how can you explain to other people. That is how you want to tell yourself. Practice. And when you go, that is how you basically explain things. I'm sure many of you have examples that are variations of the same, but you've been in a fix where you have to explain something. It may be complicated too sometimes, but then you have to find a way to explain in a very simple way, especially when you go into an executive presentation. So I want to pause here at the end of the story number 3.
I can ask another question, or do you want to go through the stories, Ravi?
No problem. We can go back. That's fine.
Yeah. What do you do in situations where you don't have back of the envelope calculation, right? Like
That's a great question. I think as a good best practice, what I have done, not during the initial days, because that is the time when you make mistakes, but over a period, you learn your own lessons. And then one thing that I've realized is that no matter how good you are, how well you prepare, you still need help because you're trying to do a lot of things in front of a collective wisdom of so many people that you're presenting always puts you in a defense. So the best practice that I've always followed was to take along at least one or two of my colleagues, preparing them very well to help me if I get stuck in some problem, especially in any calculation like the one that I talked about. So there are people who can bail you out when you are struggling. At a minimum, what can happen is that you definitely don't look bad, even if they also fail. It means that we are trying to show something complicated, and in a larger forum, you're having difficulty explaining it. But no one would doubt that as a genuine kind of calculation. So that is the minimum that you will come out with if you go preparing at least a couple of your own team members to help you when you get stuck in that kind of situation. You should always do that. So let's go to the story number 4 with the same spirit. Let me go a little bit faster. Here the situation was that one of my coworkers was presenting the product owners. These are the VPs of YouTube's, of the Google advertising, Google Cloud, search, apps, and all the other big products. And the product manager, my coworker, was presenting how to guide to help them, how they can put the infrastructure to a better use with some of the techniques like do this and this is how you should see the benefit. Do this and this is how you should see the benefit. That is what the how-to guide was supposed to be. And this presentation was definitely more kind of semi-technical because one example I can cite is that let's imagine you have an executable which has a footprint. When it's loaded into main memory, it occupies certain footprint. Now, if you made some improvement to your compiler and you recompile your executable, the footprint can get smaller, and therefore it occupies, or rather it requires a smaller amount of main memory, right? Very easy to explain. In the same way, that compiler can also improve your executable from using less amount of computing while it gets executed. So these two can be seen as more efficient use of the computational and the main memory resources by compiling your code so that you can benefit from this improvement. So that is one example. There are many other examples that my coworker was explaining, but this is a pretty involving topic, and it was basically a session where a lot of people were there and they were asking a lot of questions. So I explained the situation, and then the task at hand for my coworker was to explain different techniques. Do this and this is how you see the benefit. Do this one and this is how you see the benefit. That is how it was going. But then at some point he became kind of like defensive, in the sense that he was trying to cover all the slides and cover every technique that is out there, so that he can finish his slide deck and show them all the tricks in the trade. But the problem was that there were a lot of questions along the way, and people were asking him questions left and right. Initially, my friend was okay taking some or fielding some questions, but pretty soon he became pretty defensive, and he was seeing the questions as obstructing his flow of the presentation, or it's going to delay him, or they were even challenging him or doubting what he was saying. So when he came to that point, he started not so much being rude, but saying that can you pause all the questions, let me cover my slide deck, and then we'll, if there is enough time in the end, we'll cover them. I think the end of the presentation he did okay, but then he didn't really look that good, because as one of the people in the room, I can also share the conventional wisdom was that he should have put a smiling face and be more receptive to answering questions or taking questions. And the takeaway that we have, or the learning that we have from this experience, was that it's always good to solicit questions and put a smiling face and ask people to feel free to ask you any questions, because it is not necessarily a sign that they don't really agree with you. It is not a sign that they're disagreeing with you. It is just that sometimes the topics can be so involving that people find it very hard to follow what you're saying, and you need to help them, take them along with you. And by putting a smiling face, you should be receptive to answering questions. So be enthusiastic, solicit questions. And last thing that I want to say on the best practice is that when you look at executives in the room, each of them might be representing a different function, and they'll have a different perspective. And more or less, it's guaranteed that they'll have at least one question representing their function, and they will ask you something or the other. So be receptive and actually expect questions and be receptive to answer them. So I'll pause for a moment, before we go to the last part of the story. This is the end of the story number 4.
Yeah, hi, Ravi, this is Josh again. So from your experience, how much of an executive presentation is about hard fact or conveying the information versus also getting like a more of an emotional or like that soft skill buy-in?
I think that's a fantastic question. In fact, Josh, I wish I had the wisdom to answer your question. I don't think I do have that. So with some humility, let me just say this. It's a very difficult problem because emotionally winning people will take a whole different skill altogether. But what I think can help is remember the socialization of your deck, one-on-one with your stakeholders or the executives before you actually make the presentation. That can be pretty helpful because whatever sentiment that they have, they're going to come out clean with you. In fact, some of the executives I've seen have told me on my face, I disagree with you. I'll still come along to this presentation because I have to. But I'm telling you right now that I will ask some questions expressing my own reservations. And it is actually good because you know that upfront and you know what to expect. Because if you didn't know that or didn't do that upfront, you would be shocked or surprised in the actual presentation. And it might also feel like you may not be emotionally ready to take them along with you and answer the question in such a way that it's okay to disagree, right? It's not always necessary that you or the executives agree. That is never a reality, right? We all know that. Sometimes we may disagree. But I think the important part is that you can disagree without becoming disagreeable. That way, you'll still be seen as a go-to person who is receptive, who can hear other perspectives, but then you are still rational in explaining your point of view or your perspective. So the key point is doing homework, and second is to make sure that you are disagreeing, but you are not disagreeable.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So this is the final story again, makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. So let me set the stage for you again. The situation was that, the UX team, the product, and some of the engineers and sales operations people, we've done a lot of research for over 6 months in emerging markets. How small and medium-sized businesses use Google search on mobile phones, on desktop, and variations therein, and the situations that they're in, how they perceived the product, and what is their feedback over the research that was done about 6 months. So the topic was not going through each and every story that we had covered over the 6 months period, but instead the essence of all this research put in the form of 5 to 6 findings that we summarized, and just making sure that the executives understand what those findings were. So the lead of the UX research was presenting this topic, and very clearly we all knew that it's a half an hour presentation, 30 minutes, and we can expect 15 minutes of questions and answers, which leaves only 15 minutes for the presentation. And also it also means that my research experience lead cannot have more than 10 or 12 slides, because that will take way more than 12 minutes or 15 minutes to talk, and we'll run out of the time. So all this we knew all along. But then my UX researcher walked in with something like 100 slides into the meeting, and they were about a sari seller in India or a boutique seller in Indonesia, and examples of that kind. which were like pretty interesting for sure. And executives were all over these examples. But then that was not the topic of the day. So as soon as my research lead started covering like 2 of the examples of the interviews, needless to say, we are close to running out of the time. And then some wisecrack asked the question, so what are the research findings that you have? Because I thought that was the topic of the day. And then someone said that is like slide number 75. And we were on slide number 3 or 4. So it kind of like really felt awkward for my friend to kind of like make everyone wait and jump through the hoops, go to slide number 75, and then start talking about very quickly the research findings. And of course, the remaining 5 to 10 minutes that he was left with, he really couldn't do a good job presenting the remaining part of the slides rather than the findings. Instead, it was kind of like going back and forth between the slides and trying to find the right slide to present. And in the anxiety, not putting out the finding in a very clear and nice way to present to the executives in the room. So the learning from this experience was that when we look back, we as product managers and as presenters have to keep certain things in mind. The 3 things that we need to keep in mind: how much time do you have? How do you assess of the time that you're given that you will really have time to speak? And last but not least, how to up-level the conversation if the executives in the room are all going to be senior level, or how to get to the down and detail level based on the audience, and essentially changing the tone or the way that you present based on the audiences to who you are speaking with. So the takeaway is, never try to cover all of the slides. If you came with like lots of slides, sometimes it may be okay, you may walk in with lots of slides, but be very clear what are the main themes you wanted to cover for the time that you're given. Cover that nicely, and once you're done, maybe you can digress and maybe you can talk about a few other things. But you are there to accomplish your mission, achieve that, then do something else. So the takeaway is, convey the main themes, don't push for covering all of the content, and essentially fine-tune the level of the conversation to the audience and the time that you're given. So that's the end of my story number 5. So thanks a lot for your patience, and appreciate all the time that you all have given me. I'll pause here if there are any other questions.
Thank you, Ravi. Those were really interesting stories, and I'm sure a lot of us relate to them, right? We've all had these moments. I have another question around, and then we can open it up for shout outs if others don't have questions. As I think deciding the nature of the meeting sometimes, how do you distinguish whether you're calling in an executive meeting for counsel, for guidance, brainstorming, or for a decision? And the preparation and the presentation for each of those meetings are different. So I'm just curious if you have any tips or strategies for either of those formats, right? Like if it's an update meeting with remote work, I think there's an opportunity to do it effectively asynchronously. But if there's a meeting where you need counsel or guidance, or you need a decision to be made, or you need brainstorming from senior leaders who have more experience and more horizontal vision of things, I'd love some tips from that front.
Excellent question. So fortunately, in Google and many other companies that I worked with before, let's come to Google more specifically. In every executive presentation, right up front, before you even start talking about the topic, the very first thing you need to tell the executives is, what is the purpose of that presentation? And we have very easy way to describe the nature of the presentation, why we are here. There are only 2 categories. Informative. This is to share some piece of data or evidence or information that I have. The second category is decision making. I need your approval. I'm seeking your approval for certain things. It could be beta launch, it could be actual product launch, or it could be to go ahead and build the product. A lot of times you may need the permission to build the product because it commits the resources into product development process. So all of them might require, some approval. So a binary classification between why are you here, we put that up front and saying informative decision making. That comes out first. So that goes to, addressing your question to some extent. And the very second thing we do is the first slide. Sometimes people do it, towards the end, but I have tried to do this more to the beginning of the presentation. And it looks like this. Why are we here? What do we need from you? People also put this as my ask or what I need from you, right? And what will happen next? So we put that right up front on the slide number 1. It could look something like this. In one of the examples that I talked about, I was seeking, rather my coworker was seeking the beta launch permission for the budget recommender. So he would come in and say, decision making as the nature of the meeting. And the purpose is approval for beta launch of budget recommender for large advertisers. And what happens next is we will launch to customer X, Y, and Z who are participating in the beta program for 3 weeks. And during these 3 weeks, these are the metrics we track for the success of the product or the beta launch. And these are go, no-go conditions to decide whether we go for full launch of the product after beta period ends or not. So all that gets captured upfront, in the first slide itself before we talk about the rest of the content. Similarly, the informative side of the slide will look something like this. This is to educate or inform you of the UX research that we have done in emerging markets on Google search. Right. That would be the topic. And then what we expect from you is to, there is no approval needed, but it's more of informative in nature. So we'll just like say, the ask would be informative in nature and nothing more that needs to be added there. As next steps, we will say we're going to publish the findings and make some recommendations about making changes to the product to appeal to the emerging markets so that the product gets used a lot more, based on these findings, something to that effect. So what is the purpose of the meeting and what do we need from the executives in the room? What the next steps are gets covered as part of the first slide. And that is how I have done in the past. And a lot of people do the presentation first and they put their last slide. And the only reason I do it upfront is because you may run out of the time and you may never get a chance and you'll be rushed to talk about that. That's why I try to put it up front and everyone clearly knows why we are there and there is no confusion about it.
Thank you. That was super helpful. I hope others also found it as informative as I did. And I took some really interesting tips, including, I think, someone shared Nemawashi, yeah, Rochelle. Thank you for sharing that. That's pretty cool. We're open for questions, any comments. You want to share an experience, or if you want to give shout outs, please, this is your time. Let's use our rest of the time for the meeting as collaboratively as we can. Anyone wants to share a project or ask any question, Ravi, please feel free.
No, I just want to thank everyone. As I said upfront, this is, you may not discover or hear something that you didn't know before. It might most likely be familiar kind of, themes. It is just that sometimes it helps to reinforce what you already know so that it becomes like, our second nature as product managers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, one thing I've started doing before even at the beginning of the meeting, I just kind of give a TLDR version, so more like an executive summary, but make it that way. And, setting the tone for the rest of the conversation as well, that here's what we're going to cover. Mm-hmm. Any shout outs, folks? Anyone wants to share a project they're working on? If you're hiring, if you're looking for a job, feel free to use this forum at this time. So responding to your question, Vasu, we will be publishing the recording of this meeting on the Products That Count site. So feel free to access it. And we'll also take some of the incredible content that Ravi's shared, and there'll be some blog articles around it as well. So yes, you will have access to the content. You may not get access to the slides themselves, but the content will be available through the recording at products.com, productsthatcount.com. Okay. Wow, quiet group. All right. Okay, then we'll give a minute back to everyone. Thank you so much, Ravi. Really appreciate it. Just great stories. And like you said, thank you for reminding us some of these basics and how important it is to keep practicing these strategies to be effective communicators. So thanks a lot for volunteering your time, and thank you all for attending, and we'll see you again next month for another very interesting conversation.